One mistake that's easy for both new rider and old rider is running the wrong cockpit size. Maybe your handlebars are just too wide, or maybe your stem is slightly too long. But how to decide? Well, we're going to lean into the experience of some really fast racers to find out what the perfect cockpit is for you. Thanks to FSA, we've got a range of stems and bars to explore different cockpit setups because, well, it is personal and there is a huge range of different bar widths, different rise of bar, different stem length, different rise of stem. But it's really, really important to get your cockpit set up correctly, and it can be confusing with so many different subcategories of mountain bike, but it is important. Here's more from Gee. How important is cockpit setup for you?
Yeah, it's vital. I mean, it's the most important contact point on the bike, you know.
Okay.
And there's just so much variation. You can run everything slightly differently, but as soon as it's out, as soon as it's wrong,
yeah,
it's devastating, and it's something you really notice when you're riding.
Bar width. This is often measured in millimetres, and effectively we're talking from tip to tip width. Rise. This is the vertical rise of the handlebar, so measured from the centre section here to the outside. It can be 15, 20, 25, 30. You get the picture. We can go all the way up to, well, 75 mil if you wanted. Sweep. There's two main types of sweep with handlebars. There's up sweep, which is where the bar sweeps up from the vertical, from the centre clamp, and then there's back sweep, which, as you can imagine, is how far the bars go back from this centre clamp. The final dimension on handlebars is the diameter. And, well, there's still some older 25.4s out there, but in general, we're talking about 31.8 and we're talking about 35 mil. And we're talking about the diameter just here. That's the clamp diameter, and you've got to match that with the stem that you're running. The next core dimension on a stem is your stem length. Where it's measured exactly will depend brand by brand, but essentially we're talking about length. And we're aiming for something around that centre point of the clamp area to, well, the rear centre of the stem. So where that preload cap goes through. The top of this stem might look flat, but it's actually -12, this stem. So that means that the bar clamp here is sort of -12-degree position from where this steer clamp is. If it was 0, it would point further up. And this is one of the key dimensions on lots of other stems, is what the angle is. And the angle is set, well, at a fixed point from the steer. So you'll be able to get them where they drop down or where they pop up a little bit, giving you extra rise on the handlebar. Downhill, or DH, and XC, aka cross country, at the very core of mountain biking. Why? Well, we go back in time a little bit, and one of the first races was actually a downhill race called the Repack. It was the stuff of legends, and it was one of the things that fused and catalysed everyone coming together and really creating mountain biking. So there's this group of core riders racing downhill. Suddenly they realised actually there's a whole mountain to enjoy and explore, and that meant that gears got fused to our bikes. So, well, downhill did kick it all off, but very quickly this trail riding scene grew into cross-country racing. And it's these two pillars of the sport that really help guide us and have for almost half a century. But what can we learn if we're riding, well, not really just cross-country and not really downhill? Well, we can learn a lot from the racers that are still at these bleeding edges of the sport. So we're going to chat with two very, very fast racers. Someone called Gee Atherton. You might have heard of him. He is still very quick on a bike, and he's raced a lot, and he's got lots of experience. He's got national titles. He's got world titles. He's also won Hardline, which is a really gnarly race. Hopefully you've heard of that too. OK, DH side, I feel we've got sorted. And to cover XC, we'll speak to Kenta Gallagher. He's a former World Cup racer in both cross-country and downhill, and is now the race and technical coach for Cannondale Factory Racing. Downhill is a downhill time trial, so it's all about speed. And to have lots of speed, you need lots of control. So a downhill mountain bike setup is all about balancing, well, the needs of the racer and getting that control and composure on the bike. And you can be optimised by setting up your cockpit perfectly. Downhill bikes have 200mm of travel front and rear, sometimes a little bit more. That's a lot, and it shows that they can cope with huge impacts at really high speed. But what are the cockpit characteristics that we see as a general trend across lots of the bikes? Well, lots of them have got really high front ends, and some of that's to do with making sure that the rider's position is primed for these big drops. The other thing is also keeping their body weight and centre of gravity balanced on the really steep terrain of modern downhill tracks. Another thing is relatively short stems. We're seeing 45mm, 40. And this is again to make sure that that body weight and that centre of gravity is in the centre of the bike. That means that the bike can perform in terms of its suspension, it can work well, and the rider can push it into turns. The other thing we're starting to see more of is, well, used to be that we used to see mega wide handlebars, where we'd see over 800mm width. But these are starting to come in a little bit. There was a trend where handlebars were quite narrow, and downhillers were some of the first to push them wider and wider. And why does this extra width help? Well, it gives you a little bit of stability because it's harder to make a turn with a wider handlebar. So it slows the steering down. This can be a real benefit. It can also brace and give you more stability. But think about doing a really wide press up. That's actually really hard if you haven't got the strength. So downhill racers, like many other riders, are sort of starting to bring them in. So we're not seeing the super extremes anymore, but those are the general characteristics. But let's chat to Gee about his specific setup. So Gee, what are the core dimensions of your cockpit setup?
Well, I run the FSA gradient bar and stem. I run the bar width 780mm wide with a 25mm rise. They've got a 31.8 clamp site. They've got an 8-degree back sweep, 5 degrees up sweep, and I run quite a lot of rollback of the bars in the stem.
So interestingly, it's an alloy bar, and FSA give you the option of running a carbon or an alloy one. And you were talking before about how it's the compliance of the aluminium bar that you prefer. You prefer that feel of it.
Yeah, and compliance is the right word there. It's so important. It just gives a slightly softer feel. There's slightly less feedback coming through the bar on a downhill track that's long and rough. You know, you're getting hammered. And if it can make it slightly easier on your hands and arms, then that's only going to make it a bit nicer.
OK. There's lots of different dimensions on the bar, but I noticed that this is the 31.8 clamp diameter versus the 35mm. Is that to do with compliance or, yeah, just explain your choice?
Yeah, it's similar to running the aluminium bar over the carbon. It's just about having a bit more compliance on a long, rough downhill track. You get a bit less feedback through the bar. Yep. And the 31.8 clamp width just offers very similar, makes it slightly softer, slightly more movement in the bar, and just takes out those harsh bumps.
Gee is extremely experienced of riding his bike at the very limits of grip and traction. And I think there's that saying about 10,000 hours to become an expert in something. I feel like Gee's got that times 10. And it was fascinating to hear what he was saying about how he sets his bike up. And for me, I think one of the big take-homes was being systematic about it, even to do with bar roll and lever position. So spending lots of time just doing one of those changes. So let's say we do bar roll first, and we live with the brake levers being in a slightly awkward position, but just to make sure that that bar is in the right rolled position. And that rollback position changes how the sweep, both the up sweep and back sweep, feels. So it is really important. I think the first thing that Gee kind of really settled on was how steep World Cup tracks are. And they are death-defyingly steep. And with the steepest of tracks, Gee will play around with different rises of bars. So between, I think, the 25 and 40mm rise. And that means that his centre of gravity and his body position is going to move slightly further back. So you can be able to take the extra steepness and not just sort of collapse into the front of the bike. So that's one thing. The other thing is how rowdy at really fast World Cup speed and World Cup tracks are really rough. And for Gee, he prefers the feel and compliance of the aluminium bar. It is personal. Some other racers prefer using a carbon bar, even on downhill race bikes. And that's because the manufacturers say that they can tune the stiffness slightly more with a carbon bar. It is personal, but tuning that bike for you is one of the keys. At the other end of the riding spectrum is cross-country. And as the name suggests, there is a bit of a cross-country by its nature. But how cross-country is now versus where it was where we were just riding across country has changed radically. Courses are a lot tougher, not just with metres climbed and the technicalness of the descents, but also some of the really technical features, jumps and big drops. So they are riding really tough terrain. They're also riding, well, not by themselves. They're riding in a pack. And all of these impacts mean that the handlebar setup that you need on a cross-country bike is really quite different from that of a downhill bike. Cross-country bikes, of course, are different too. We've got much less travel, down to 100 or 120. Sometimes we're still on hardtails as well. And the other factor is that we've got, well, to ride the bike all the way around for about an hour and a half. Very different constraints. So what are the core differences? Well, I think all of the factors that we're going to talk about with XC bikes are all to do with, well, bike fit. Why? Well, because you're on that bike and you're trying to optimise the bike fit for you, because we're having to pedal around for an hour and a half, hour and 30. It means that we're optimising lots of the bike fit things, not just for how the bike handles and how it performs, but how it fits the rider as well. So one of those things that you'll see is longer stems. So some of this is to change the handling a little bit and calm the bikes down, especially on climbs. But the other thing is to try and fit riders, possibly riders that are running a frame size a little bit too small for them, to get enough stretch. The other thing is that these are pro athletes and they are very flexible and they want to have the best climbing performance. So you'll see lots of XC races with negative stems, where the stems go down quite a lot. And this is a thing of moving that centre of gravity, just like with the downhill races, but they're moving it towards the front wheel. You might be confused, why is this? Well, lots of cross-country racers are highly skilled racers and riders, so they can tackle a lot of tough terrain. But where they need the extra help and the extra sort of muscle memory is being able to keep that front wheel pinned to the ground while they climb up really steep slopes. And having this body position change of pulling the bars down lower to the front means that that back wheel and that front wheel can stay hooked up on the ground. The other differences to cockpit dimensions from downhill to cross-country will be that bar width. So bar width has grown. There was a period of time when cross-country races ran with extremely narrow bars, and they had to have bar ends on the ends for the extra leverage. Thankfully, the bar ends have melted away and we've got comfy grips to offer the different comfort positions. But those bars have grown. Not as wide as downhill bikes, but they have grown. It's down to personal preference because some racers still like a very narrow bar. So choosing your bar will be personal, but slightly wider for XC can be a good thing. We chat with Kenta Gallagher to find out more about how the Cannondale factory XC team set up their bikes. And I guess my first question is that, unlike downhill racers who've got, well, all they need to do is maximise control. That's their only sort of remit of setting up a bike. With cross-country races, it's much more nuanced. You've got the need to set up a bike to control it. You've got to have the kind of ergonomics and then also comfort. So it's, you know, it's a balancing act. And how do you start that process?
Yeah, it's quite the balancing act, I guess. I think the process kind of starts with, you know, being comfortable on the bike in general. So that normally starts with a bike fit. But I believe that just going on the bike fit and then taking that straight to the trails is not really the correct way. So I think you want something that you can feel comfortable with for long hours, comfortable with going uphill, comfortable with going downhill, whether it's the road, gravel, just something that you feel like, you know, like you can press on the pedals all day. And I think it kind of starts with that, and then you can fine-tune bits and pieces here and there.
It'd be fascinating to know how you balance out all those impacts. You've got the sort of ergonomic, I guess, data and metrics from a bike fit, but then you've got to kind of think about the comfort of the rider, and I guess that's super personal. And then there's also the kind of control and being in the kind of very enviable position of having raced World Cup XCs and World Cup downhill races. I think you're probably in a unique position to be able to kind of help these XC racers understand the extra benefits. But how do you manage this process?
So yeah, I guess from the bike fit, we can go along with, like, you know, the width of the bars, but that's super personal, I think. And people say your shoulder widths are basically a guideline, but I think it just depends on what you're racing and how you're racing. And short track compared to the XCOs, we will, you know, trim the bars down. It's not unknown, and we use the KFX bar, and I think it kind of gives like a good compliancy. It's not super stiff, and it's not, you know, like too much of a flex, and the riders seem pretty happy with it. And I think with the stem lengths, with the geometry of bikes changing, reach changing, wheelbases changing, the characteristics of the bike are super different to what they were 5 years ago. And I think that's the one thing that I've noticed in those years, that we've managed to come shorter from, like 80s, 90s mil stem to 60s, and, like 50s aren't even off topic as such. But it's kind of depends on the rider and what they're looking to achieve. With the bar height, I think, like with the KFX stems, you can have different negative stems, but I think we're around the negative 12. But we do put a spacer underneath just to allow them to just change that depending on the track, because obviously if it's a steeper track, we can drop it or raise it. But normally I just quite like them to keep it, like whatever they train with, just keep it the same, because they know it's going to react in that way. But yeah, I think with the way the tracks are going, and whether you're a racer or not, I think if you have one of these modern day down country bikes, you will notice that you're able to shorten everything and, like make it a bit more comfortable. And I think before stems were at your knees and stuff like that, but I think you're going that fast now that there's just absolutely no chance you're able to get away with stuff like that. And if you do, you're definitely going to get left.
With bike races that can span almost 2 hours, or, well, even longer if you're at something like Cape Epic or some of the really long marathon MTB races, well, you've got to optimise comfort and control. And also, I guess the biggest thing is that bike fit is really important. So we'll start with that bike fit. Everybody's proportionality is different, and how they fit onto a certain frame size is going to be different. You can have one person who's the same height, but their body makeup and how their body is made up of different torso length and different leg length is going to be different. So using stem length and bar width, as well as saddle height, is going to be, well, the key thing to making sure that you can be as optimised as you can be for getting all the power out of your own body, not just your legs. We talked about comfort and control as well, and those things are really key, because you've got to be comfortable because you're on the bike for such a long time, and you're going to be putting the hurt on yourself, so you don't need to add any more hurt. But you've got to have control. These tracks are not to be messed around with. They're really hard. So it is a fine balance between comfort and control. But with time and being, well, not dissimilar to Gee, systematic about the approach, changing bit by bit, you can find that optimised position. Some XC racers choose one-piece bar and stem combos. These can save weight, and they can be optimised for stiffness and comfort. So for some XC racers, they can be perfect because they offer up just the right amount of stiffness and strength. Downhill and cross-country are at the two extremes of the spectrum of mountain biking, but I feel like we can all learn something from this, and we can pull it all together. I'm going to talk mostly around, well, a trail bike, because it's a brilliant do-it-all bike, and you can do a lot. And changing the cockpit setup can help you do, well, a bit more of that kind of gnarlier downhill stuff, or more of that horizon hunting cross-country stuff. So let's break it down. We're going to start with a handlebar. There's a lot of different variations, and we'll start with one of the key variations, which is material. Effectively, we've got aluminium alloys, or we've got carbon composites. With carbon composites, you've got, well, often a slightly lighter bar, and initially, often they were quite a lot stiffer. But things have changed, and materials can be tuned a lot, and many manufacturers, FSA included, say that their carbon bars are more compliant and more comfortable. Obviously, riders' demands mean that you can choose whichever option you want. And there's lots of different options in carbon or alloy. With alloy, it's often better value. It is at a lower price point. Sometimes they can ride slightly stiffer, but there's options out there. OK, what else are we going to look at handlebars? Well, one of the things that we looked at on Gee's bike was the different rises. And that's really important, depending on what steepness of terrain you're riding or how aggressive you are on the front of the bike and where you want to position yourself and your centre of gravity. Riding a slightly higher rise bar can help a lot. It can be really comfortable to have a little bit more height on the front. The next thing to talk about is, well, complex. We're talking about upsweep and backsweep, and it is very personal. Personally, I quite like a lot of backsweep. So I reference that as a position of looking at the bar side on, and we've got sort of a very flat position with not a lot of lift on the grips. And I just prefer that position, and it is personal. What can often happen is if you're running your bar quite rolled forward, it can bring you a bit too far forward, it can move where your hands are, and it also kind of moves your centre of gravity a little bit further forward. Depending on the shape, it can pinch the sort of corners of your hands a little bit, but with good grips, don't worry about that too much. I guess the final conundrum with handlebars is width, and they've certainly got a lot wider, and I think we're starting to see a sort of tipping point on handlebar widths where we're starting to come down to more reasonable widths. If a giant of the downhill world and a giant physical presence such as Gee is running a 780 bar, do we all need to be riding, well, 810 bars or maybe 805s? Depends. If you're taller than Gee and you've got a broader stance, then perhaps. But I think for a lot of riders, a slightly narrower bar can be good. I say narrower, talking around 760, 750. Again, think about that stance of when you're doing a press-up. And if you've got an extremely wide stance, perhaps you've got an extremely wide back, and you're really strong as well. Maybe you can do the press-ups in that really extended position. I feel like many people will probably be happy with a slightly closer together position, but it's something to tune and fettle for you personally. So with the stem, we've got a couple of dimensions that we can play with. So the first one is length. Essentially, moving the stem to a shorter length will move your centre of gravity back, meaning that your bike might become a little bit more playful, might be more fun to do wheelies. It might also mean that when you're trying to climb up steeper hills, that, well, your bike has more propensity to wheelie. So balancing it out is a careful act, and many brands have now got this sorted in terms of, well, it's matched to the top tube length. But if your torso is longer, then you could try maybe a 5mm or even 10 or 15mm longer stem. If your torso is a little bit shorter, you could go a little bit shorter, but just be mindful that as you go shorter, the steering speeds up, and as you go longer, the steering slows down a little bit. So fit and fettle as you like. The next thing to consider is the rise, and this is a slightly odd term, I know, but it's the angle of the stem from this 90-degree point of the steerer. So it can give you a little bit more height. So if you've got a very low steer tube, you might need that to gain the altitude. Or if you've got a very high front end on the bike, some head tubes can be quite tall, you might look at positioning it slightly lower down, help move that body weight further forward. Again, using the stem position can help you a lot on those longer days out. So it's one of the optimization positions that DH racers are using for handling and XC racers are using for bike fit and ergonomics. The final piece of the conundrum is the diameter of the bar, which will lead to the diameter of the clamp on the stem. We've got two standards. We've got 31.8 and we've got the newer 35. Both have got pros and cons. You'll often see carbon bars in 35 and alloys in 31.8, but you can get a mix of both in both. It's really up to you as to which you go for. Personally, I'm a fan of the 31.8, it's slightly slimmer, and for me, it's often more compliant. But if you're a stiffer, burlier rider, then maybe you like the extra stiffness that a 35mm clamp can provide. Okay, that's a lot of information to take away, both on the DH side, the XC side, and how you can pull all of those practice together for your own trail bike. I think the key take home, though, is A, cockpits do matter, setting them up does take time, and it's worth the investment. So be systematic, be incremental in those adjustments to make sure that your handlebar setup is perfect for you. And let me know in the comments below